8 tips for evaluating Disney Lorcana cards. So it's spoiler season, or it just was, or it's about to be. With the rate that new sets are coming out, I thought as the veteran TCG player here at Lorcana University, I'd give you 8 tips on how to figure out if a card is any good or it's a trap. Number 1, if you like the card, just play it. TCGs are made for a variety of players, not just tournament grinders. In fact, Magic the Gathering, which has been around for 30 years, has tons of data to suggest that the vast majority of their players never have gone to a tournament and probably won't. They much prefer to stay at home and play with their friends, their silly, crazy decks that they've come up with. So if you want to play an all hey deck, they're going to continue to print silly hey-heys in order for you to do that. But if you're one of those poor unfortunate souls which has to win in order to have fun, I do have more tips for you. Number 2, compared to my peers. So good game design should make decisions hard. There should be no obvious right answer. So with many cards as they print that are very similar, same ink, same cost, there are minute differences that make one slightly better in one scenario than another. Sometimes Lorcana doesn't get this perfectly right, or it's not as obvious as you'd think. I'm looking at you, Jumba and Verana. But understanding what to expect out of a card helps you identify when a card strays off of that baseline. Take 3 ink 2/3 characters that quest for 2 and have an ability. This is a pretty standard stat line that exists in almost all inks. So when they printed the new Ursula, Deceiver to All, everyone was enamored with her ability to double songs that she sings. But one thing to notice is this is missing a lore pip. She does have a disadvantage, and that disadvantage could come up in a certain scenario. Maybe you're doing a draft and you're past one of these, and you have not taken any songs at that point. You won't accumulate the critical mass of songs needed to make this character pay out. So maybe you're going to prefer, in that situation, a Mulan Free Spirit instead. Understanding what to expect out of cards helps you understand their strengths and their weaknesses, and play to their strengths and away from their weaknesses. Number 3, the floor. One way to evaluate a card is to understand its floor, or its fail case. Imagine a scenario in which anything that can go wrong has gone wrong, and you're left with nothing but this card. This helps you prepare yourself for that inevitable situation in which this card is on its own. Take Tamatoa So Shiny, for example, from set 1. You can imagine the fail case for this card being that we have no items in play and nothing in our discard pile. That makes this a 8 ink 5/8 that quests for 1, and that's pretty bad. The next question is, how likely is that scenario to exist? Now, any Tamatoa deck is going to play a ton of items. However, those same decks usually play Hirams and Judy Hopses as a way to cash in those items for card draw. So it's not necessarily a given that because you have items in your deck, you'll have any in play. It's true that you'll probably have some in your discard pile from banishing them for value, but with the rise of Magic Broom decks, it could be the case in which those are swept away. So understanding your fail case, the situation in which this card is a complete flop, will help prepare you and adjust for your meta, the people that you play with most commonly. So perhaps if you have somebody who's really enjoying playing a all brooms deck, a Tamatoa deck might not be the best pairing for that group. Number 4, the ceiling. So the opposite of the floor is the ceiling. So imagine a scenario in which everything that can go right has gone right. This is usually the dream scenario that initially snares people. And sure, we can dream up this scenario in which this card is absolutely a bomb, but then we have to ask ourselves, how likely is that scenario to exist? For example, I've been working on a pretty ill-fated Lucky Dime Tamatoa deck myself, and I'm trying to create a scenario in which I have 6, 7, 8 items in play so that I can quest with Tamatoa, activate my dime, and generate 16 lore to win the game. But truthfully, how likely is that scenario to exist? How easy is it to get that many items out while still being in the match? And that's when the reality sets in for a lot of these cards. When you describe the scenario in which this card is going to win, sometimes that description is pretty outlandish. You'll hear a lot of people say that they have a turn 4, turn 5 win, but when you dig into it and ask them how does that work, it involves not having an opponent. A lot of these strategies will fall apart when they're confronted with a turn 1 Captain Hook Forceful Duelist, for example. Tip number 5, from behind or off the top. Another way to evaluate your fail case is to imagine a scenario in which you're losing the match. Your opponent is poised to win the match and you need to draw something to turn the tides in your favor. Now, off the top of your deck, you draw, insert card name here. How excited are you to have drawn that card? Will it change the tide of the match? Or what situation does your board need to be in order for that card to change the tide of the match? And then you have to ask yourself again, how realistic is that board state in reality? The truth is, you always are going to have to decide as a player, do you want an explosive, crazy deck that every once in a while does something memorable, or do you want a very consistent competitive deck that can do the same thing in and out and in and out? Number 6, while ahead. So the opposite of from behind is while ahead. There are very few cards that you would draw while you're ahead that would be pretty bad, right? These are usually some niche cards like a Be Prepared after you've already banished all of your opposing characters, or a Lucifer when they don't have a hand left. But drawing these cards after you've already done their thing isn't necessarily bad, right? Only if you can close out the match in a reasonable time. Lorcana does have very strong top decking. Unlike other games, they're guaranteed to draw something they can play every single turn. So being able to close out that match in a reasonable time may involve running less of these cards after you've already done their thing. And playtesting will help you fine-tune how many of these cards you need to run so you don't get flooded with these discard cards when they have no hand. Number 7, win more. Who doesn't want to win more? What's wrong with winning more? Win more describes a card that only really does its best when you're already ahead of your opponent. And if you're behind your opponent, they work poorly. So these have a lot of fail cases in which they can't off the top or while behind bail you out of any situation. Take the card Steal from the Rich, for example. This card from set 1, this big, uninkable, overcosted action, usually at first screams crazy lore swing. We dream up a scenario in which we have 7 or 8 characters, we play Steal from the Rich, and then we quest, and we're able to remove 7 or 8 lore from our opponent and gain a bunch ourselves. Now, did that win the match? Maybe not. If we were able to safely quest for 7 or 8 out of sight of some strange race scenario, and we're not worried about losing all of our characters from them cracking back against our board, did Steal from the Rich really change that outcome? A Win More card describes a card that the scenario in which it's at its strongest is usually a scenario that could have been easily accomplished with other cards that are more consistent and done in a simpler way. And once again, that comes back to the old choice between a swingy explosive deck or a consistent deck that doesn't require a lot of these synergies and crazy situations in order to pull off. That's not to say that one is better than the other. Chances are these swingy explosive decks that run crazy cards will have matches that are much more memorable than the one that consistently wins day in, day out. And that brings me to number 8. Tip number 8. Evaluating cards is hard. And historically, the community is very bad at it. Magic the Gathering, which has been around for 30 years, has made over 100 different sets. They've had playtest committees made up of the best players to ever have played the game. They still get it wrong set after set. They still make cards that are not balanced correctly, and they have to use a ban list in order to keep their meta healthy. And that is never their intention. They want cards to be balanced across all of the sets that they make and all of the colors that they print. But they often get it wrong. It's like a 3-body problem. You make one card that you think is super strong, people gravitate towards that, and then somebody comes in the back and makes a deck that can topple that king and sits on top of the throne. And then another person comes behind that to beat that player, that deck, and then pretty soon it's a free-for-all of cards you never considered would be any good. So knowing that it is a complex problem of whether or not a card is good in all scenarios, including some that you don't imagine, I say just go out and build the deck that you enjoy playing the most. But hopefully these tips help you pick out cards and be a little more consistent and not in the clouds with how you expect them to perform. All right, for more Lorcana content, like and follow Lorcana University.